Hello, and has anyone ever had some kind of odd feeling in their head whenever they hear a certain sound or trigger, I guess? Perfect. I was really hoping someone at least would. If yes, then you have experienced ASMR, which is what I would like to talk to you about, and how including in the next edition of the Sound Studies year can improve upon it. Now, for those of you who don't know what ASMR is and what it stands for, it's an acronym for Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response. And, and it is when someone gets a tingly feeling on his or her head whenever he or she hears a certain thing or trigger. These triggers can vary from someone tapping on a mic or just whispering. The reading that I would like, the reading that I would think that would work in the, oh my gosh. The reading I would like to include in the next edition of the Sound Studies Reader is Now You Got the Shiveries, Effect, Intimacy, and the ASMR Whisper Community by Jocelyn Anderson. I think that this reading should be included because it talks about the rise of ASMR, what it is, the feelings that arise from experiencing it, and the communities that are centered around ASMR. Now, the ASMR community was incredibly isolated at first, with people not realizing how many people experience triggers the same way they did, until a Yahoo group shared trigger videos and expanded the ASMR community. The internet has been a huge part of the increase in those who listen to ASMR because of the ability to share and find these videos. Also, the internet has allowed people with similar interests to find each other with and try to talk to them about whatever it is they are interested in. Anderson also talks about why people listen to these ASMR videos. People who have listened to ASMR say it's a solution for stress, insomnia, and including an ASMR's feeling in comfort, bliss, and euphoria. These sounds are therapeutic for a listener, and the Sound Studies Reader doesn't really talk about much about sound therapy. Some people also listen to ASMR because they feel an intimate relationship with the performer. Now I believe this should be in the next edition of the Sound Studies Reader because it is something not covered in the previous edition. And since it's so new and started gaining attention around the publishing of the book. Also, ASMR can connect to some chapters that are already within the book. Like the first chapter that I would like to talk about, The Auditory Dimension, written by Don Ide, which divides sight and sound into their own separate dimensions, but it still explains how they can overlap. In ASMR, the performer whispers or makes certain sounds into the mic, and these sounds are part of what Ide calls the auditory dimension. However, these videos are videos, and do have some visuals to go along with it. Sometimes it may be what's in the background what the performer is wearing, or tasks that the performer is doing, like folding a towel. These heavily audio-focused performances would land between the auditory and visual dimensions, but it is closer to the horizon of silence since the sounds that are being made are so quiet. Also, I talks about how with the improvement of technology, people can start to see sound and how the improvement of technology is important to ASMR. Like the creation of the binaural microphones, which take the shape of an ear, of a person's ears, and when played back, the audio will sound more real life, with sounds coming from the left and right, and you can actually tell how far away things are happening. Also, with improvements of microphones, it increases the quality of the sound quality in these ASMR videos, which makes a better experience for a listener. Now, the other chapter that I think relates to ASMR is 4.5 Film Fallacies by Rick Altman, and talks about how important audio is in film. Now, these ASMR videos are heavily focused on audio, so ASMR videos relate to Altman's chapter because it shows how important audio is in a media that is so visual. Also, Altman says that not everyone can experience the same thing when they hear something, which is also similar to the fact that everyone has different triggers when it comes to experiencing ASMR. Like how some triggers, like rustling paper, writing on a chalkboard, and crinkling plastic, which makes some people feel relaxed, compared to how others would feel hearing that and feel annoyed. Now, with the inclusion of this chapter, it would have to result in 2 other chapters from the current edition of the Sound Studies Reader to be removed. And I think one of those chapters that should be removed is Contradicting Media Towards a Political Phenomenology of Listening by Judy Blund. The main idea of this chapter focused on the history of radio broadcasting in Canada and how influential it is. Now, the radio is an important part of sound. However, this chapter didn't really put that much effort put that much attention on the radio and what is done. Instead, Boleyn talked about how private investors ruined the radio and that the number of independently owned stations was decreasing. Boleyn talks about how topics like how the radio stations try to make money ruins the listener's ability to make their own choices. Also, she talks about how greed of record companies and radios have ruined small musicians. This chapter felt like it was attacking big businesses and not really talking about the radio itself. The radio does have a big impact on people, but I feel like this chapter fails in showcasing it. Now, the other chapter that I think should be removed is Following You, Disciplines in Listening and Social Media by Kate Crawford. This chapter focused on how influential social media is for people, politicians, and companies. The chapter itself is good and informative, easy to understand, and somewhat ahead of its time at points. This chapter did feel kind of outdated, like when Crawford called microblogs called posts on Twitter microblogs instead of how we would call them posts or tweets, and calls Twitter a microblogging service. Also, Crawford is talking about listening to social media. She's really talking about just paying attention to and actually reading. So since it isn't really talking about actually hearing anything, I feel like it should be dropped from the next edition of the book. There are some points from this chapter that do seem relatable, like how Crawford says that big companies would use social media to help support their business, and like how politicians would use social media to talk to people, like how Trump uses Twitter. I think that this chapter is great, but I don't think it has any place in the I think it does not have any place in the next edition of the Sound Studies Reader. And in conclusion, I feel like the next edition of the Sound Studies Reader should include Now You Got the Shiveries, Effect, Intimacy in the ASMR Whisper Community by Jocelyn Anderson, because of its ability to talk about the rise and connection of the ASMR community and the effects it has to the listeners. As well, this reading does relate to The Auditory Dimension by Don Ive and 4.5 Film Fallacies written by Rick Altman. But we would have to take out Contradicting Media Towards a Political Phenomenology of Listening by Judy Bland and Following You, Disciplines of Listening to Social Media by Kate Crawford. Hopefully you will consider my proposition, and thank you for your time.
Hi, my name is Moomal, and today I'm going to be talking about some editions that I have for the second edition of the Sound Studies Reader. People today are constantly immersed in sound. The cacophony of the sonic world guides people throughout their environment. However, sound remains absent for a select group of people. The deaf community has a strong culture that is almost impenetrable from outside communities. Yet one device made for the deaf community has struck a debate. Cochlear implants are devices made for deaf people that bypass the eardrum completely and stimulates the cochlea. The second edition of the Sound Studies Reader should include more articles about the deaf community because you can't really study sound without studying the absence of sound. And what better way than to study the deaf community? The second edition should include Chapter 3 of Stuart S. Bloom's The Artificial Ear, Cochlear Implants and the Culture of Deafness. It includes the history of deaf culture and how the cochlear implant was introduced and integrated into the deaf community. Although the history of the deaf community is a bit long, it includes pivotal areas in deaf history and how deaf children, the more important years in development, have survived in society with them. The article addresses both perspectives of the argument and explains the resistance towards cochlear implants. The part of the community that dislikes cochlear implants sees it as a way to cure deafness, but the problem with curing deafness is that the deaf community sees it as a characteristic that you have, such as your skin color or hair color or even eye color. So this kind of puts a social stigma around the deaf community. They also prefer to use CAM, which is complementary and alternative medicine, because cochlear implants are an unnatural way to refine your hearing. The biggest downfall of this article is that it is French-centric and focuses mainly on French deaf people, but it does talk about how French deaf people moved to America, so it kind of does encompass the world a bit. It also brings up an interesting point that cochlear implants actually weren't popular at first, not because people didn't want to use them, but because they simply didn't receive enough media attention. But the part of the deaf community that knew about them did not want to subject their kids to this experimental treatment and raise false hopes. More importantly, this article respects the deaf community and recognizes the solidarity they found in sign language. Before cochlear implants, the deaf community found recognition when televised screenings included people signing what was spoken. So they saw the combination of speech and signage and didn't really need a use for cochlear implants. They found it as an effective way of communication. The deaf community's complicated relationship with cochlear implants is reasonable because they only wish to be seen as ordinary people. But some also see it as a prosthetic similar to eyeglasses. This article encompasses the deaf community's view on cochlear implants in the background explaining why. So the cochlear implant is a fairly new invention, and Mara Mills's article, Hearing Aids and the History of Electronic Miniaturization, discusses the electronic growth necessary to create such devices. Mills talks about cochlear implants, but only for a brief section that's thrown at the end of the article. The article mainly focuses on the history of electronic miniaturization, but the history overpowers the main topic of the article, which is hearing aids, the first two words. Although Mills's article is primarily a history lesson, she does bring up the interesting idea that deaf people fear others appropriating their culture by wearing hearing aids to refine their already fine hearing. However, Mills's article does not have enough information about cochlear implants and their complete relationship with the deaf community. So the next edition of the Sound Studies Reader should include the entire issue and the entire topic in the deaf community. The second edition should also abandon Shuhei Hosokawa's article about the Walkman effect. In spite of its age, Hosokawa introduces the relationship between sound and architecture, and it also integrates sound into sociology, which exhibits the interdisciplinary nature of sound. Hosokawa mentions Schaefer, a pioneer in sound studies, and expands Schaefer's idea of the soundscape as the physical environment around us. His explanation of musica mobilis is relevant because it defines the layers of sound in an urban environment, which is the environment that dominates our society today. However, the syntax of the article is a bit confusing, and the title of the article and content are disconnected. The title suggests that he would talk more about the Walkman and its effects, like the specific Walkman effect, but the article explains the Walkman's relevance later on in the article. If anything, the article is too long and has an irrelevant ending to the main topic. Albeit the modernity of musica mobilis, the article is a bit outdated and speaks primarily to an older audience when younger audiences are also drawn to learn about sound. The recognition of sound in the environment and the cohesiveness between sound and the environment is the main point of cochlear implants, which is what James Lasher defines as intelligibility in his article, Fidelity versus Intelligibility. Intelligibility is the naturality of sound, which he talks about in the context of film, but it is essentially what cochlear implants are striving to reach for the deaf community. The article does lack in a few areas, like he poorly explains the phonographic model, and the author clearly favors the intelligibility side, so he barely talks about fidelity. But since the article is talking about sound in film, Lastra abandons sound to talk about vision at parts. But the discussion about vision portrays how complementary sight and hearing are. Sound in this article, like the Walkman effect, shows sound in other fields, but this article is more relevant because film will always be relevant. Sound in film will always surpass time. Lastra also adopts the term point of audition, which describes where the person is in their environment in relation to their hearing, which is a skill absent in the deaf community since their vision compensates for their lack of hearing. Perception is the main topic of this article, but Lastra also differentiates listening and hearing, and since sound studies is a newer area of in education, most terms in sound used to be synonymous, but now it's important to differentiate what the terms are. Lastra also talks about vital topics in sound studies that pertain to many subjects. So fidelity versus intelligibility should remain for the second edition of the Sound Studies Reader. The articles that should stay are address basic ideas in sound studies. Thus, sound studies would not be the same without R. Murray Schafer's revolutionary idea of the soundscape. The soundscape is important because it is a term that places all disciplines on an equal ground. As this article is older, there are some sections that are kind of useless, like he talks about the Grecian concepts of music, unless you're into that. But along with music, Schafer mentions social welfare and the relationship between touch and sound, which proves his point that each discipline deals with aspects of the world soundscape. Schafer, however, is kind of obsessed with sound. He romanticizes sound when the other senses are just as adequate in assessing the environment. The deaf community would be appalled, honestly, by Schafer's perspective of sound, yet he establishes the basis to understand sound studies. One thing the article also discusses that is relevant more to today's world than Schafer's world is noise pollution, which the deaf community can avoid as a trade-off for not hearing sound. The soundscape is the reason for cochlear implants and describes what the deaf community is missing out on, but it also is just the basis of sound studies. The second edition of the Sound Studies reader should keep the soundscape and fidelity versus intelligibility for their contributions to the basis of understanding sound studies. On the other hand, hearing aids and history of electronic miniaturization and the Walkman effect should be cut from the second edition due to their outdated material and irrelevant discussions. To respect the deaf community, Chapter 3 of The Artificial Ear, Cochlear Implants and the Culture of Deafness should be included for the next edition of this anthology. The deaf community may not hear the various sounds of the world, but to include deaf culture and sound studies only progresses our learning of the sonic world. Thank you.
For the next edition of the Sound Studies Reader, I propose a reading dedicated to a human voice. Now, why voice? Well, first of all, the voice section of the Sound Studies Reader is kind of outdated, and voice, it seems it was left out of the Sound Studies Reader overall, and I felt like the voice section was kind of all over the place, a little too specific on its topics. And a chapter on voice would serve as a great introduction to the overall subject of voice. And voices are unique and interesting, so why not? Alright, what I expect from this new reading is for it to be clear and concise. Not too specific, because voice is such a broad spectrum, and provide real-world examples, and you'll see those when I talk about the reading in a few moments, and have relatable language, because we know that some of the readings were a little confusing, because some were a little too philosophical, others had huge words that no one knew, the neologisms, basically. And dedicated towards other majors, which would be confusing for others who wouldn't be interested in, like, say, film or music. The new edition I would like to include is entitled Voice in Sound Making. The author is Barry Truax, and it is Chapter 3 in the book Acoustic Communication. It provides everything that I've listed earlier, and it's a fairly recent document, so it's not too outdated. 2001 doesn't seem recent, but compared to other readings, it's more recent to this time. And there are five major topics. The first topic is called Voice and the Whole Person. Basically the mechanics of voice production, starting with air in the lungs, then the vibration of the vocal cords, and then shaped by your vocal tract, your mouth and your throat. Also in this article it says, voice reflects the person's personality and intentions, as every voice is unique. Voice also is the most prominent thing that children hear when still in the fetus. That's why they say talk to your children, because the brain is adapted to recognize voice. The next topic is voice and self-image. back to early development, voice is basically acoustic signals. Like when a mother hears her child cry, that alerts the mother to its needs, whether it's hungry or tired or etc. Voices and sound are different from when you're recording. So if any of you have ever listened to a recording of yourself, you know you sound different. And it's just because you have an internal voice that has a different pitch than what you hear on an external recording. Paralanguage is another topic. This is basically understanding the meaning of an utterance. So simple words like "oh" or changes in pitch all indicate meaning. And if anyone has ever heard the phrase, "it's not what you say, it's how you say it," this is also under the category of paralanguage, your voice quality. Then there is sound making in pairs and groups. Voice is a very intimate form of communication. We use our voices in our everyday lives. Voice is predominantly the thing that we hear the most, other than other sounds. Voice in groups also reflects relationships. So, for example, you wouldn't speak to your siblings or your friends the same way you speak to your professor, unless you're like, "Hey, Dr. Wolek, what's up?" And you know how when some people start talking and then another person's just like waiting to talk? It's like speaking through groups and pairs helps to indicate group structure. And this is something I like to think of as like common courtesy, like wait till someone finishes speaking until you start to speak yourself. Then there's acoustic persuasion. It's the last one. This is ultimately the styled form of sound making. So whatever vowels or any words that you stress, basically. Like when you're speaking, you want to have a loud speaking voice. And this also helps for people to know that you know what you're talking about, or to try to convince them to buy something, basically. Alright, readings that should leave. I know I'm talking about voice, and then these readings also include voice in the title, but this is just to improve the voice section. The first one is The Grain of Voice by Roland Barthes. Barthes would rather focus on the logistics of music rather than voice itself, although I understand where he points out Pheno and Geno song, which you use your voice, obviously, but there's something to this that seems contradictory. There's a quote that said, this is paraphrase, "Geno's song has nothing to do with the communication, representation, and expression of voice." I would argue that it does, such as loud voices indicate probably anger, low voices, sadness. The next one is Starship Africa. Author is Michael Veal. This one focuses on music again, specifically dub reggae. One thing that was good in this article was that it questions Veal was not afraid to question the ethics of changing voice. But ultimately, this doesn't really help the subject of voice, as in dub reggae, which we listened to, is the voice is kind of lost behind the music. So ultimately, there's no real advantage for this article in the Sound Studies reader. Now, readings that should stay. First one, Multiple Voices, written by Adriana Caballero. This focuses on the uniqueness of voice, and like every individual has their own voice, their own pitch, their own way of speaking, maybe an accent. Also, gender can also have uniqueness, like feminine voices for females singing or high-pitched is more attractive, and for males, low, deep-set voices. Tone equals meaning. So overall, the originality of the voice combined with the gender can generate feelings of pleasure. depending on your preference. Lastly is The Linguistics of the Voice by Mladen Dolar. This one I feel is most similar to Truax because he focuses on communication, which is in the title of Truax's book. One thing that was appealing in this article was the fact that Dolar acknowledges that emotions can be conveyed without words. So if you're yelling or crying or whispering, those are all emotions that we don't really need words to express. Well, maybe not whispering, but you know. Also included is internal voices, and it says this is known as the voice that cannot be silenced. Everyone has an internal voice. Can't really stop thinking to yourself. In conclusion, I feel like Truax's article of voice and sound making would be the perfect inclusion for the second edition of the Sound Studies Reader. It meets all the expectations of being broad, being relatable, having those real-world examples, and so on. And those 5 major topics break it down just enough for us to understand what he is talking about. Also, he acknowledges that voice is not just what is coming out of your mouth. It is the thing your brain has adapted to process over time, and how in early life, that's the thing that starts it all. And emotion and communication. Communication with yourself, with other people, emotion through pitch, emotion through certain words. So I hope that you find this topic interesting as I did, and hopefully you agree that it should be included in the second edition of the Sound Studies Reader. Thank you.
So the topic I think should be added to the second edition of the Sound Studies Reader is John Cage and his prepared piano. Now, who is John Cage and what exactly is prepared piano? Well, John Cage is a 20th century music composer that basically pioneered the way for avant-garde music. You might know him for his infamous 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, but he has also written many more pieces related to avant-garde, including prepared piano. Now, what is prepared piano? Well, it is basically using stuff like nuts, bolts, and pieces of rubber and like lodging them in between the strings of the piano as shown in the picture. This makes the piano sound more duller and more percussive, and these it could take hours to like set up the piano. So the new proposed reading is titled Cages, Sonatas, and Interludes for Prepared Piano, Performance, Hearing, and Analysis by Jeffrey Perry. And what this article delves into is it basically, it tells you how to listen to Cage's music. You can't listen to it like any other normal piece of music. He describes it as a cyclic whole, like a circle, rather than a mere collection of pieces. I think this should be included because it gives attention to what I think is an underappreciated composer and style of music. I think Cage should be known for more than just 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Some negatives about this article is that it has a heavy use of music theory and notation, which might be difficult for a general audience to understand, and it is a little bit of a long reading too. So one chapter I think should stay is chapter 34, Noises of the Avant-Garde. This is very related to Cage and his avant-garde, and gives a basic history and shows a few examples, such as the sound poems and the noises of war. Talks about the Cabaret Voltaire and where avant-garde was born. While it talks a little bit too much about war and could be a little bit repetitious at times, I think it's important to understand the historical context related to avant-garde. The second chapter I think should stay is chapter 34, Music Research and Psychoacoustics. So this also deals with avant-garde, but it's more of a different perspective. The previous chapter I stated was more about sound, and this chapter is more related to music. It talks about manipulation and transformation of sound, and while it's not exclusive to avant-garde, I think it's important to realize the importance of it. The chapter I think should be removed is, I should say, chapter 18, Audiovisual iPod. I was originally going to choose the Walkman effect as a chapter to remove, but after some thinking, I realized that this one should be removed instead. While this chapter has a different style as he responds to quotations, and there's no other reading similar to it in the book, I think the Walkman effect gave a better history and explanation of portable music and how society interacts with it. Also, this chapter had what I call quote fluff, had a lot of similar sounding quotes, such as, "It transports you to another world, it makes you feel like you're in a music video," or "It isolates you from society." The second chapter I think should be removed is Dentists of the Intermundane. While I do think this was an interesting chapter, I think it was a little bit too niche for general audiences, and I don't think it really fits out of the book and feels honestly out of place to me. Now, while you might argue that avant-garde is niche, I think it's important to recognize John Cage and avant-garde and how it's important to music as a whole. So in conclusion, I think Cage's sonatas, interludes for prepared piano, performance, hearing, and analysis should be added to the reading because it gives appreciation to John Cage and avant-garde style music. Thank you.
Okay, so my presentation is going to be on the Sound Studies reader and why a reading about the significance of post-punk should be added. So my new reading is Prologue, The Unfinished Revolution from Simon Reynolds' book Rip It Up and Start Again, Post-Punk 1978 to 1984. And this reading gives an overview of the beginnings of post-punk and how it was a response to the decline of punk, which occurred around 1978 to 1979. And their goal was to avoid the rock conventions that degenerated into a commercial formula when used by punk artists. So they wanted to explore a lot of new sounds and new influences, so genres of music like dub reggae and progressive rock and disco, and in addition to other influences like literature and politics and art, especially the Dada art movement. Their main goal was really to just deconstruct rock music. And this reading incorporates a lot of the book's themes really well, so noise, especially noise as it relates to sound and music, and sound as a response to politics or a political tool, and soundscapes. And it does so in a really accessible way. So one of the main influences of the post-punk movement was Dada art movement. And so the band Cabaret Voltaire, they even explicitly took their name from the Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich, Switzerland, where Dada was founded. And in other ways, they were really influenced by Dada too. So Cabaret Voltaire was an industrial band, and they were very synth-based, and they didn't have a drummer. So in that way, they were trying to deconstruct the traditional structure of a rock band, and they also used a lot of noise. And in their industrial sounds, it was a lot of noise-based, abrasive sounds. And they're really influenced by this affinity that Dada had for noise. And they were in not just Cabaret Voltaire, but other bands too that were more noisy and industrial. They were more focused on making sounds and new textures over the accessibility of their music. Another band that was influenced by Dada and had an overt reference to Dada was the Talking Heads with their 1979 song I Zimbra, which took its lyrics from a Hugo Ball sound poem. So another influence on the post-punk bands was the soundscapes and landscapes that they came out of. So Devo and Pere Ubu were two bands from Ohio. And Devo was an Akron band, and Pere Ubu was a Cleveland band. And these cities were both industrial cities that were becoming more run down. They were becoming less wealthy. And Pere Ubu took the grotesque aspects of these sounds of the city, and they incorporated it into their music. And they created this grotesque music, and it was also very industrial and abrasive a lot of the times, with these long passages of noise, ambient noise, inspired by the industry of Cleveland. And Devo was less noisy in that way, but they took the grotesque nature of the cities that they were in, and they created a more sci-fi leaning approach. They were also influenced by the Kent State shooting because they were Kent State students. And in that way, they incorporated politics into their music, but it was more of a disillusionment with politics than some other bands who had explicitly political statements made, such as Gang of Four. So Gang of Four was a band that had Marxist, leftist ideology leanings, and their lyrics were very overtly about these Marxist ideas. Their whole thing was that personal is political, so they wrote a lot about consumerism and the commodification of daily lives and interpersonal relationships, and their lyrics and their music became a tool to put forth these ideas about consumerism and their disillusionment with capitalism. And The Fall was a band from Manchester, which is another bleak industrial city, but they used their music in order to critique the life of people in Manchester and the factors that contributed to what Marky Smith, the lyricist, saw as a low quality of life. And he was influenced by magical realism as well in his lyrics, so they ended up being these sort of spoken, sang rants that had this Northern English snottiness to them, and then he was also making these political statements about Manchester. And another thing was the DIY or independent labels of the time, such as Factory Records and Rough Trade. And these labels gave artists more freedom, and they sort of represented the leftist ideals of a lot of these artists. So they were non-corporate, and they were a place without as much concern for commercialism and making money. They had very low budgets most of the time, and they could only press a certain number of records. But artists were drawn to them because they were a place where they could put out these albums that communicated leftist ideas and overt political statements that weren't commercial. So the readings that I think should stay would be Noises of the Avant-Garde and Recording Studio as Fetish, because of the way that they complement the new reading. So Noises of the Avant-Garde explains the main goals of Dada art, and obviously Dada was very influential to the post-punk movement. It also explains the beginnings of noise as in their art and as music. And in the same way that the post-punk bands were trying to deconstruct rock music, the avant-garde artists were sort of deconstructing fine art in a way. So there's a lot of parallels between the artists of the avant-garde and their goals and the artists of post-punk. And then the recording studio as fetish gave insight into the recording process itself and also production and how this can influence the sound of an artist. And this was really important in post-punk. A lot of the bands sounded the way they did because of the production available. So Joy Division was a major band, and Martin Hannett, their producer, is what gave them their distinct, really cold, atmospheric, dark sound. And they also had a lot lower budget than what is explained in the reading, which contributed to their sound. Like for instance, the Joy Division song, one of the Joy Division songs was recorded, the vocals were recorded down a telephone line because that was what was available and that was what could be used to give them the desired sound. And this also contrasts with the larger bands of the 60s and 70s that post-punk artists were trying to avoid. So those artists had a very large budget and they could produce these big albums, which their gear was closer to what is described in the reading, but it shows this contrast between what was available to the post-punk artists and what they were trying to avoid. And the readings that I think should leave are The Sound of Music in the Era of Its Electronic Reproducibility and The Telephonic Uncanny and the Problem of Communication, because apparently I hate readings by guys named John. And both of these readings were super complicated and they had a really abstruse, esoteric writing style. And this didn't really add much diversity in a book full of these styles of writing. So the new reading has a more accessible writing style. Reynolds was a contributor for publications like Spin, and he has a popular press perspective, which makes his reading a lot more accessible, and he's able to unify many topics in a way that the Telephonic Uncanny was unable to, in my opinion. So post-punk, I think, is a really underrepresented music style. It's underrepresented in music writing and analysis of it, and I think that it should be talked about a lot more because of what it was doing and how revolutionary it was, especially compared to punk music, which is talked about a lot more. And the reading goes over a lot of the major book topics and incorporates them really well, like politics and history, and it really just shows how sound can be used as a medium for subversive art.
Hello everyone, my name is Sophie Tender. So in the Sound Studies Reader by Jonathan Stern, it's a blend of different ideas about sound, noise, silence, and how it affects culture and humans. Many of the ideas in it are basically like a history lesson, but also there's more ideas about just like thoughts and ideas and like philosophical ideas about sound. So through the book, the chapters I chose to stay and to leave were based on how well written and organized they were, so we'll get into that further. But the new topic idea I chose is how to prevent hearing loss, especially in the military. And for that, awareness is the first step. But in the military, there are many dangerous high-frequency noises that are potentially damaging to workers, especially those that serve in occupational specialties such as like armor, infantry, artillery, things like that. And it even got so bad after the Vietnam War that there was a study done that 40% of people who served in Vietnam had problems with hearing loss, more so than the people who did not serve at all. So in the late 70s, the DoD required periodic surveys of hazardous noise environments throughout all branches of the military, and this caused a change in design standards and equipment such as weapons and aircrafts, which brings me to the 3 approaches of hearing conservation, which the first approach is engineering, which is the most expensive take on it. It takes the most time and the most resources because, think about it, you have to go back and change everything that you've already done. So like aircrafts, any kind of like guns or machines that make a lot of high frequency noise that are damaging to your ears, you have to go back and now fix all of that that's already made. So that takes a lot of resources and time and energy, and that's a lot. But with that, you can go back and say, here's the source of the problem that's causing these damages, and that's when you fix it. I think that's more of practice for the future, because now that we know that it's a problem, we can say, hey, let's do this before it's an issue. And then the second approach is identifying individuals who are more vulnerable to hearing loss. I think this is a lot less practical because it's kind of hard to say, oh, you're going to have a problem with hearing loss, or like you don't really know. So unless you have those medical waivers and things like that, you don't really know who's susceptible to it. But this way we can keep those people from certain jobs and also cater to them and do more to protect them. Like I said, the effectiveness varies because you have trouble identifying the people. And then the third and most commonly used approach is to design and implement a hearing conservation program. These programs educate workers on the dangers of high-frequency noise and provide devices such as earmuffs, earbuds, and in workspaces. And also on the list was hard helmets. I don't know why, but apparently that does something for your ears. But I think this is the most practical. But also you have that kind of counteractive side of, are the people actually going to use these things? Because if you're like on a battlefield, if you're in combat, it's not likely that you're going to be using earmuffs or earbuds due to not being able to do your job correctly. So that's another thing to look into. Let's see. I should probably use these slides. There's that for the Vietnam vets. Okay, so for the first topic I chose to say would be The Laughing Machines by Jacob Smith. I thought it was a great topic. It described the emergence of the laugh box, which was really popular in the late 1950s. The background laughter helped viewers connect to the TV shows and understand subtle or like hidden jokes. The reading should stay because it was interesting, well organized, and just overall well written. It really added to the ideas and topics going through the sound studies reader. Okay. The next topic I chose should say is The Auditory Dimensions by Don Ide. It's an interesting read about different sensory dimensions overlapping to give our brains more information about the objects around us. A great example of this is echolocation, because I just think it's fascinating that sound can paint a picture even when sight is absent. Even though it was a really philosophical chapter and a little bit hard to understand, it was well written, so that made up for it. And I think it's really important because it covers a broad topic on an important idea. Again, like Laughing Machines, it was well written. Okay. And the one that I chose to leave, the number one, is The Soundproof Study by John Picker, which is about the anti-street music movement. During this time, street music was seen as an important source of disturbance. This caused many fights for silence. Eventually, Thomas Carlyle came up with the idea of a soundproof study. So, in other words, it's a room that could not be penetrated by sound. I think that's a little extensive, but this reading should be cut from the sound studies reader because of the excessive wordiness and bad organization. Like, it was just a hard chapter to read overall. I had to go back and read it a few times to understand it. And then the second topic I chose to leave was 4.5 Film Fallacies by Rick Altman. It questions the importance of sound in film creating. The ontological fallacy really stood out to me because I couldn't disagree more, honestly. This fallacy states that sound does not have much importance to cinema, which is just not true at all. Cinema has been really progressing over the last few decades because of sound. Like, there's so many things that we're learning that we can do with sound now. That's not just like what's on the screen. It doesn't have to do so much with pictures. The organization of the reading was all over the place, and there were so many metaphors that just made me lose focus on the main idea. So it's like I was like a fish, like looking for what I was trying to pay attention to. So in conclusion, I hope others see the importance of hearing loss conservation in the military to bring about change, because like I said, awareness is a big thing. The reading would greatly contribute to a new edition of the Sound Studies Reader. Thank you.